Now, you know that the concept is relatively simple. It's just that whatever key you're in, you number the notes of the scale, and the chord corresponds to the number. So if you're in the key of C, and you have a C scale, then every note gets numbered. Really, we wouldn't use the 8. And then we would refer to the C chord as the 1 chord, the F chord as the 4 chord, the G chord as the 5 chord. This is pretty basic stuff, and I think you're all familiar with that. The difference, the thing to understand about this, because musicians everywhere talk about 1, 4, and 5, and a 2 chord, and a 6 chord, and so forth. That's not something that's unique to Nashville. What's unique to Nashville is the way that this stuff is notated, the way that it's written. And what's really wonderful about this book, he does go into the theory. There's a pretty detailed explanation of what's behind it. But what I love about it is that he has a disc, really a DVD, that goes with it. You can pop that into your computer. And there are charts for every one of the songs. But what he did was he had 6 different people write the chart. So, for example, for this song, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different versions of the chart for the same song, written by 6 different people. And the point of that was to demonstrate just how much variation there is in what people do. The theory concept doesn't change. A 1 chord is a 1 chord, a 5 chord is a 5 chord, but the way that people notate these things will change. And understanding that is important because there are things that are standard and there are things that aren't. And where this is the most important is when you're in a session environment or when you're working with studio musicians, even if you're not in the studio really, because this stuff happens live too. But virtually any session musician in Nashville reads these charts. It's pretty much the standard, and the system was developed in the 50s and 60s as just a convenient way of working with vocalists. So the leader would write a chart, session leader, and let's say the singer wanted to try it in a lower key. Well, rather than having to rewrite the entire chart in a new key, if you had it in numbers, then the musicians will just think of the scale and can just plug in the notes. So it's a whole lot simpler than having to sit there and cross things out or look at one letter and think of another one. And it's also, I know the way that I hear is absolutely related to this, because what we're really dealing with is not just some mathematical abstraction, but we're dealing with a sound. We're dealing with the fact that a 1 chord sounds like home, that a 5 chord generally brings you back home. I grabbed my guitar, but the piano's closer. So if I'm in the key of C, and that's home, and then I go like this. I'm clearly not finished. A 5 chord wants to resolve and wants to return back home. So there's a particular sound that chord has, and when you learn to identify what each one of those sounds is, we were talking about this yesterday, with just the idea of you're putting names to sounds. A 1, 2, a 3 is a particular sound. 4, 5, 4, 1 over 3, 2 minor, and 1. So you can learn to differentiate in your ear the difference between, say for example, a 1, 4, 1, and a 1, 2, 1. They're just different different sounds, different tonal colors, and then it becomes, it ceases to be math. Then it becomes music, because you can listen to something, and like, for example, when I have to learn a new song for a gig or whatever it is, or something I just want to learn, I generally am not learning it with an instrument in my hands first. I'm just listening and picking up on what those relationships are and getting that in my head. Because say if I'm going to sing the song, maybe I don't know what key I'm going to sing it in. So I want to have in my head what those relationships are, and then I can try whatever key. Or I can try different capo positions, which is something that I want to get into, which is why I brought those out. So it's an important skill to have from the listening perspective, and then from the perspective of somebody who might be going into a studio to record material and might have other musicians that you need to communicate these things to. Since most players in Nashville that do session work with number charts, it's something that you want to have some familiarity with. The basic difference between a number chart and regular music notation, aside from the fact that we're using numbers instead of letters, is that we don't use measures. There's no bar lines. You don't indicate beats with quarter notes and half notes, or even with slashes. Like you might see something like this in a standard chart. Which would just be 4 counts of a C chord, 4 counts of an F chord, 4 counts of a G chord, and so forth, right? In the number system, we don't bother with the slashes, we don't bother with the bar lines. We would just say key of C, and generally that's in a circle at the upper left. And then you might just see this, where each number signifies a measure. So that's 4 counts of C, 4 counts of F, 4 counts of G, and back to 4 counts of C. It's really pretty simple. One of the first gigs that I did when I got to town, I was asked to fill in with a band I'd never played with before on the guitar. I didn't know most of the songs. Yes?
What if it's shorter though, or longer? What if there's more counts?
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
I was asked to fill in. I did not know the songs. The bass player was calling out chord changes to me, but instead of saying it's a C, it's a D, like say the song would start and he would say the intro is 1451. And at first I'm, wait, what does he mean? And then I realized that that was what he meant. A 1 chord, a 4 chord, a 5 chord, a 1 chord. It's a very convenient shorthand. Now, Zach, you asked a really good question. How do you indicate when there are more beats or fewer beats? Now, if you're in a different meter, like if you were in 3, you would literally just write in 3. And that now every one of those is 3 counts instead of 4, or in 2. Or sometimes people will actually write the time signature, but more frequently you'll see in 2, in 3, in 4. But something else that happens is you'll see things like this. Where those 2 dots indicate beats, or they might be slashes. It might look like this. And what that means is we have 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Pretty simple. And this is very, very, very common. Or let's say, for example, you have multiple chords in the same measure. Like what if it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, then we get this. And the underline indicates that these 2 chords happen in the same measure. We would assume that it's 2 counts each because there's nothing telling us otherwise. But it might be different. Maybe it's 3 counts on one and 1 on another. Maybe it's this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Well, there's a couple of ways that might be indicated. Some people would just do this. Now, in regular written music, that dot means to play something staccato, short and sharp. But in the number system, it just indicates a beat. Sometimes you will see people use a note. You might see that. And that's often enough to show that. In other cases, you might see this, actually using the note values, borrowing from traditional musical notation. Or we might just go back to using the dots or the slashes, and you see something like this. Three counts of a 1 chord, 1 count of a 4 chord. 3 counts of a 5 chord, 1 count of a 4 chord. Now, remember that this system was invented in a time where country music was really very simple. You didn't have a whole lot of complicated chord changes most of the time. You had pretty much 2 or 3 rhythmic feels that a song would have. I mean, it would be, well, no, it wouldn't be that. Or maybe it's a waltz. But more or less, there were just a handful of possibilities of what it might feel like. And so you don't have to have a whole lot of flexibility in how you show rhythm, because all you have to say is waltz time and everyone would know what that means. You say two-step beat, everybody would know what that means. Modern music, modern country music, modern Nashville, obviously has so much more pop in it now. So there's different rhythmic patterns that we come across that we need to be able to indicate. So, for example, one of the most common ones is what most musicians elsewhere in the country might call an anticipation, which is when you have something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, where the chord changes on the offbeat. 1 and 2 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 4. The Nashville term for that is a push, and that's indicated like this, with a little arrow. Now, here's another example of something that has a meaning in regular music notation. In regular music notation, this is an accent, meaning that you would hit that chord harder. In the number system, this is a rhythmic anticipation, or as I said, a push. And that just means that this chord has been pushed over, so it happens a little earlier. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So that's very simple. If something's more complex than that, then you will find people using the actual rhythmic notation. So you might see, for example, something like this. Now you have to read music to know how that works, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. I left one out. So if the rhythm is any more complex than a straight count or a push, then you need to actually put those figures in there. And you'll see examples of that in the charts in this book, some of them easier to read than others. As a rule, Chaz's charts are the clearest, but I'll just kind of go around with this so you can see. Here's the rhythmic notation. And you notice that he put a box around the places where he's using rhythmic notation, because he's highlighting that fact. Also kind of just separating it. It is indicating measures. So we have the bam bam, bam bam, bam bam, bam. bam, 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 bam. Again, if you don't read music, that doesn't have a whole lot of significance, but most players that I know read at least some, and they at least read rhythms, because that is the thing you see the most. You're not reading from sheet music when you're working in a recording studio. That hasn't, I mean, unless you're working in a string section where there's something orchestral, or a horn section where you've got multiple horn players and everyone's got to have their part, those things will be written out. But past that, you don't see written music in a recording studio on any kind of pop music session. So something like this allows you to put at least a piece of that in there, but you're still dealing with the numbers, you still have the flexibility of being able to change keys. And you're still dealing with the way that most musicians do comprehend music, which is through those relationships. And then notice down here at the bottom of the page where it says lick. Well, these are not meant to be chords, these are meant to be single notes. But he's using the numbers to indicate the notes of the scale. And then he put a little star, and that means that happens here. So if the lick goes, if we're in the key of G, and the lick goes 4, 5, 6, 1, here's the G scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that means it's going like this, 4, 5, 6, 1, just taking the notes from the scale. You would know that this is meant to be single notes and not chords because the word lick is actually written in there. So there is an indication that this is not a whole set of chords, but it's a particular figure that everybody plays. A couple of the other very common things that are in here, you have this little triangle, which is sort of the equivalent of the dot in traditional notation. Now he actually does use that, because notice that here's a dot. And some people might use them to mean different things. I've seen them generally used interchangeably. I've also heard people refer to that little triangle as the Dorito, which is what I love about Nashville notation, is people have their own names for these things, but it just looks like that. Triangle. It can be on top, it can be on the bottom. But it just means a short, sharp chord, a staccato chord, which in regular notation would be indicated like that. And then the other thing that comes up a whole lot is, let's say you want to hold something, you put a diamond around it. So then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you use the diamond to indicate when you want a chord to be struck and then allowed to ring out. But it's important to understand that this is still in time. It just means that you're allowing that chord to ring for the count of 2 that it's occupying in that split measure. It's not the same as this symbol, or that, the fermata, or what some people call a bird's eye, in standard musical notation, which is just a hold. You will see this sometimes. You might even see both. What that's telling you is that the counting stops. That's the difference. With the diamond, the counting continues, but you're not striking the chord again. The fermata, the hold, means that you literally stop counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. You just let it ring out until whatever else happens.
You always do that at the end?
Well, I was going to say, that's very commonly the end of a song, but it all depends. Then we will also have things that are borrowed from standard notation, like you might see that, which is like a lot of musical terms from the Italian, and it's short for retard or ritardando, which just means slowing down, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. anything, any indication like that that might be in regular musical notation could very well be in a number chart. There's other odd indications that you'll see. I have not seen this myself, but I was told by someone that they saw this in a chart once.
Batman.
And that was an indication to do this. Batman. It's just someone trying to come up with a way to communicate with someone who doesn't necessarily read music what they're looking for. Like I said, that's an extreme example, and that might be legend. I don't know if that's even true or not. But I like it as an example because really it does illustrate the whole point of this, which is that you have musicians who need to have a common, agreed-upon language, and everyone's coming from different places with different backgrounds and different degrees of formal musical education. So you find the common language, and the common language is that everyone can learn to hear those relationships, what a 1 to a 6 minor sounds like. And that brings me to another point, that just like when you write out the names of chords, like if I wanted you to play these 4 chords, I have to write the little m if I want an A minor chord. If I didn't put that there, you would play an A major chord, right? You just play an A chord. Now, since we're dealing with a key, there are chords that belong to certain keys because they use the notes of the scale. We call those diatonic chords. We're not concerned with that in this system. All we would do is just indicate that this is a minor chord.
Oh, you wouldn't just put 6, because 6 is always minor.
But it isn't.
Isn't? If you do start in E minor.
That's the whole thing. If you're going by the notes of the scale, then yeah, it would be minor. But it isn't always, because there are songs that go. Now that had a 6 chord and a 2 chord, both of which would traditionally be minor.
Oh, you changed them into major?
I changed them into major.
You went out of the key.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, what I did was I borrowed notes from another key. And that's what happens. I mean, you might hear something like this. Like the Beatles love that 4 minor chord. Or if you think of the old song Sleepwalk, that has a 4 minor. That has a note that's not in the key of C major, but it works just fine.
So you just say minor, 4
Yeah.
minor. Okay.
So that would be indicated like this: 1, 6 minor, 4 minor, and 5. So we don't worry about what the chord would ordinarily be. We just, if it's minor, you indicate it with a minor. The other thing you will sometimes see, and this is also in standard notation too, you might just see a minus sign, and that means minor also.
So if like a Nashville, if you're in a studio and like a session player sees that and you just put 1, 6, 4, 5, they're gonna say.
They're going to play all major chords, yes.
Oh.
And that brings up another point which is worth mentioning, that you hear very few songs these days that are actually in minor keys, or at least in minor keys all the way through. Because what's most common is you'll start off in the minor key. Maybe you have something that's going. key. So the whole thing would be written as if it was in the major key. And one thing that I have noticed, which drives me up a wall, is if you have a song that really is in the minor key, like let's say I had something that was just A minor and E7, and that was the whole song, which could be, especially if you're using an older kind of, say, country music style, or could be a rock style. I mean, there's any number of things it could be. When you hear this, you definitely have a sense of that A as being home, of being your one chord. It just happens to be a minor chord. So I would write that as in A, 1 minor, 5/7, 1 minor, 5/7. And pretty much any musician in the studio would know what to do. It's not hard to comprehend what that is. But what some people will do, and it isn't wrong theoretically, it just goes against what my ears tell me, is they would put it in C and say 6 minor, 3/7, 6 minor, 3/7. Now, technically that's correct, because those notes belong to the key of C, but there's no home, there's no 1. So if I'm looking at this and I'm seeing 6 and 3, 6 and 3, I'm not hearing 6 and 3. So what that sort of reinforces is the idea of chord function, and this is the most important thing to understand about this number system concept, is that the numbers tell you the function. What is that chord doing in this key? Is that chord home, or is it something that's taking us somewhere else? And if it doesn't say 1, then to my mind that's not home. But that doesn't mean this is wrong. It just goes against the way that I hear and the way that I was taught to understand it. But like I said, 99 times out of 100, the way you hear songs recorded these days, if you start in a minor key, it will then at some point move into the major key. And so then it makes sense, because it's easier to just keep it in one key. So you're thinking from the same scale every time, than to actually have to at some point go, all right, now we're going to C. And so to say this is in A, but this part is in C, it just becomes kind of convoluted. So understand that that's something that you may come across depending on your ears and how you hear things that may not disturb you. It drives me up a wall.
I was taught that way, like there were no minor chords,
Right.
minor keys.
Right.
But it's interesting because he just wanted to keep it simple, but
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting. But my question is, if I only put, like, say I was in the key of C and I put 1, 4, 3 minor, if I put 1, are they just going to play like a C? Or are they going to do a pretty C? Or like...
This is a general outline. This tells you very little about how to voice the chords, about how exactly they're going to sound. Because a C chord could be this, or it could be this, or it could be this, or it could even... There's any number of things it could be. Those things are worked out.
Or adding colors too.
I'm sorry?
Adding colors too.
Yeah. I mean, now, let's say if you want to talk about color chords, you can use the symbols, like if you want, say, that would be written like this. Key of D, 1, 1 sus4 with the push, 1, 1 sus2 with the push. So in other words, this part is no different than what you would see in a letter chart. So any kind of chord, if it's a 7th chord, you could see 1, 7. You could see 4 major 7. And the major, by the way, is often represented by a triangle, so you might see that. Or a 2 diminished would have a little circle there, or a half diminished, or depending on how complicated your chords are getting, I mean, it's not impossible that you might not see something like this, a minor 7 flat 5 chord on 2. But just understand that you're dealing with two different things. You're dealing with number 2 telling you the root, the note that the chord is built on, and the rest of this is telling you what kind of a chord it is. So as far as chord colors and things like that, that is indicated by this.
Right.
But as far as how to actually make it sound, those decisions are made in the studio by the musicians as they play and listen to each other, as if it's an artist project, depending on what the artist and or the producer are looking for. It's meant to be a general outline. It's not meant to tell you exactly what to do. It's not sheet music where you must play these notes. It's really just a map, and it leaves a lot of room for the musicians to bring their own ideas into it, unless they're very specifically being told to play this, which is pretty unusual. I mean, if there's a lot of specific information, and all of these charts do have a lot of specific information, because you can see from the rhythmic figures and the use of the dots and the triangles and the diamonds and so forth of when things are supposed to be held, when things are supposed to be played with a particular rhythmic figure. But more common is for things to be more general